that. No, welcome to everyone. Today's about launching our latest release, which is an anthology of short fiction celebrating Cornwall's protected landscape. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a number of authors who contributed to the collection who've managed to be here today. I'll talk a little bit about Hermitage in a moment.
Hall for Cornwall, 23rd of March 2024. The launch of 12 stories for 12 sections from Hermitage Press. An unusual title for this anthology of short stories, which were inspired by the 12 components of Cornwall's protected landscape. Each author was assigned their own landscape and then challenged to come up with a short story. The idea stemmed from an earlier project which was aimed at increasing and broadening access to areas of natural beauty. Emma Browning is the partnership manager for Cornwall's protected landscape.
We created a poem with a poet on Bodmin Moor and had creative writing workshops, and that kind of was an inspiring moment where we thought this has got traction, this could be the way that we include new audiences to the landscape that have never been to it before potentially. And the editor that worked with us on those creative writing workshops then came up with an idea of, well, why don't we think about having authors write fictional stories about the landscape and create that sense of place. And then the idea became a project, and now we're stood here today and we have a book, and it's an amazing achievement by everybody, I think.
Now, I think one of the unique things about this is, from your position, you have 12 disparate places. You can't talk about one specific area. So that was a godsend in one way.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a challenge and an opportunity, I think, to have 12 separate sections, all of which are unique in their own way, diverse in their own way, but collectively stand for a third of Cornwall and its natural beauty. And how do you really communicate that to one and all, essentially, in Cornwall and beyond? And I think this really does tangibly do that by inspiring other people's imagination and then allowing people to maybe go out and inspire themselves to walk, to write stories of their own. This is just the start. I think that's what's worth saying. We've got a children's anthology being created just now. It's in draft. So we hope to have a second anthology published at some point in the future. And we want to take it on tour. So we get the authors to come and read to people and to have creative writing workshops and essentially work with people that maybe feel a sense of loneliness or people that maybe have low mental health that want to be part of a group and do something together in the landscape. So these books will be used far beyond the publishing of them.
Sentiments backed up by Dan Cooke, the Protected and Historic Landscapes Manager for Cornwall Council.
As far as we're aware, this is the first work of fiction, collection of stories that any national landscape in the UK has done, or in England and Wales has done. So it's fantastic. We think it's a brilliant way of getting people to access the landscape, these fantastic, inspiring landscapes, but through a different medium. So it's great. One of the key focuses that both government and the local authorities want to see of national landscapes is how do we connect with more people? How do we get not just the people who know and love the countryside, how do we get underserved audiences, more urban audiences, how do we get that connection? So this is a fantastic opportunity to reach new audiences in a completely untried way and hopefully inspire people to read about it, enjoy it, and then go and get curious and get out into the landscape itself.
The man charged with bringing the project together was writer Gareth Rees, who both edited the work and also has a story in the anthology himself. He says the project came together pretty quickly.
The idea essentially was to commission 12 writers to write a story inspired by each of the 12 areas of outstanding natural beauty in Cornwall. Quite a small budget, so I thought I might struggle here to get people involved. It's quite a lot of work to write a 3,000-word short story. I'd like it to be a mix of established writers and more writers just coming through. So I started off approaching people like Will Menmuir and Philip Marsden and Cathy Rentzenbrink. They all said yes, which surprised me again. So this, to be honest, right from the start, this project has been a huge surprise. All of the people that I asked immediately said yes.
It almost seems like the opposite of writing a fiction book yourself, because at least you know what you're going to get and you know the direction that stories are going to take. But this is almost like sitting in the garden with a basket and waiting for apples to drop in.
The danger is that you don't have any control over it. But actually my instinct with the commissioning of the stories was not to give a really detailed brief. I wanted the writers to be able to take it in whatever direction they wanted. And I wanted the stories to be unique to that writer and them to be different. But then the stories that came back, even though some of them are set in the past, some of them in the present, there's something that runs through them that I guess is distinctly, I won't say Cornish because they're not all Cornwall-born writers, but linked to Cornwall. There's something, an eeriness, the supernatural, a darkness that runs through them.
For author Jane Pugh, this way of creating a work was both a challenge and exciting.
Very unusual. Normally I would do that myself. I'd commission myself to go to a place and respond to it in writing. So when Gareth came along with this idea, it was, of course I will. Are you kidding? This is just such a lovely opportunity. And an unusual one. For me, exploring North Cornwall, as someone who lives in Penzance, Cornwall is big, and it was just such an amazing opportunity to explore somewhere that's both kind of familiar and unfamiliar. Something will just click, I'll just observe something, and it sets off a question in my head. So then I need to understand and answer that question. So why are they doing that? Or who are they, and how does their sense of place impact on the decisions they're making? I now need to discover that. So it's almost like I'm answering my own question as I'm writing the story.
That sense of the mysterious that Gareth Rees mentioned earlier is woven through many of the stories, something perhaps inevitable in this kind of collection, suggested Cathy Rentzenbrink.
It's interesting doing this kind of anthology where there's a unifying theme, and then as a writer you sort of breathe into it and see where you're going to end up, and then it's a conjunction between how the place inspires you, but also I think what's in your own kind of like creative composting process. So it's like what's in my stock pot, then it gets added on to what the external inspiration is, and then come up with something.
Some of the stories are very dark. I mean, does that reflect the Cornish countryside?
I mean, I think writers' imaginations tend to be dark, and they certainly have to go to dark places. Cornwall probably does elicit it, does it? I'm not sure about that, actually. I think probably everywhere does, because actually I think there's something interesting about places that are very beautiful, but then you know that there's other things happening beneath the surface. And then I definitely think coastal areas often are both beautiful but have a sense of threat. So the sea is both beautiful and dangerous, for example, so I always find that quite interesting. So maybe it's specific to Cornwall.
Likewise, the sense of Cornwall as a place also shines through many, if not all, of the works. Edward Rowe is best known as an actor and a comedian, but gladly took on the challenge of creating a short story for the anthology.
There's Cornishness everywhere. It surrounds us all the time. Cornish language is more prevalent than people realise. I guess some places are more Cornish than others. And I sort of live in the past, really, thinking about my grandparents and what they sound like and the jobs they did, like working for China clay companies. And there's just so much Cornish culture around that. I still feel very much immersed in it. And spring celebrations, you get a big revival of Cornishness. Pantomimes are a wonderful tradition in Cornwall. Fairs, carnivals. Yeah, for me, I find the Cornish culture is very much there. And if you want to immerse yourself in it, you can.
Each of the writers was paired with a guide who introduced them to their chosen protected landscape. Mark Campbell took Will Menmuir to the South Coast Eastern Protected Landscape, which takes in the coast between Looe and Parsands.
I said to Will, who I worked with, I said, what do you want to know about? And he just said, look, take me on a walk and point out the interesting things. And we started off in Lansallas Church, and, it's my local church. I pointed out things like the Pugh ends, which I think is where he's got his story from. We've got medieval carvings up there. And we just went from there. We walked down the lane which is an old smuggler's lane, down to the beach, which is famous for its cut in the rock where the smugglers allegedly brought the stuff off the beach. Just sort of gave him really, I suppose, a relaxed version of if I was doing a guided walk for a group of people. So it assures me that the tour guide that's in the story is not based on me.
Each of the stories has been richly illustrated by artist James Innerdale. The launch was actually the first time he'd met some of the authors face to face.
When you read a story, you read it in your head and there's a voice associated with it in your head. But actually when you hear the authors read it, it actually has a slightly different emphasis, a slightly different feel. And it made me think, I wondered whether I might have chosen different things if I'd heard them read it out, because they might have emphasised different aspects, different parts of the story from those that I picked up when I first read it. Doing this sort of illustration is interesting because they need to be a companion to it, but at the same time, as mentioned, that I quite like the idea of actually they add to it. They're not just an exact reflection of the words on the page. You know, there's other things in there that aren't necessarily said in the story, but you know, an illustration adds to it rather than just complements it. So it does both rather.
Representing Hermitage Press was Paul Taylor-McCartney. He is quite rightly pleased with the project, which potentially could have been a nightmare to pull together. But he says teamwork was essential at every stage of the process.
The one thing that makes this quite different is the genesis of it has come from the Cornwall National Landscape and a project there, and it was our first foray into supporting a charity. One of the trickiest challenges was making sure that the authors, each of the authors, felt they were inputting and collaborating with us. But ultimately, when you're dealing with 12 authors and 12 potential egos, we had Gareth to work through, so the fact that he was guest editor alongside me meant that we had a cipher. We called him our conduit for the talent out there to help us make sense of all of these different voices and the illustrator coming in. So yeah, it's been a pleasure.